you can, questions anytime now, if you have any, or comments.
I've got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I've got a question for Stefano. Stefano, you said that the Italian Americans were against Italian Jews in a way, and you gave the example of Il Progresso. Was it a real feeling, or was it a kind of strategy to secure their own integration in American society? And because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Jews, to distinguish the Italian American community from the Jews coming in the US at the time.
I wouldn't say that the purpose of these anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish feelings was the assimilation within US society. The hostility toward Italian Jews was the consequence of the hostility of Italian Americans toward American Jews. They struggled for political patronage, for the control of the unions, and so on. So there was a condition, a domestic condition of conflicts between Italian Americans and Jews, regardless of their national ancestry, that made Italian Americans responsive to fascist anti-Semitic propaganda and pushed them to show very little sympathy towards Jews in general. But in my view, it was not the purpose of this attitude was not that of getting better and faster accommodation within the US society, just the result of the domestic conflicts between Jews and Italian Americans.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alors, Stefano, je vais m'exprimer en français. J'espère que ça convient, mais bien sûr, vous pouvez répondre en anglais. Donc, en termes de marge et de marginalité, c'est vraiment un cas de figure extrêmement intéressant, puisqu'on est dans un phénomène de double, triple marginalisation, aussi bien d'ailleurs dans la société de départ que dans la société d'accueil. C'est vraiment un cas de figure très éclairant pour le sujet qui nous occupe. Et j'ai une question, ces juifs italiens, comment étaient-ils reçus par les juifs américains et non pas les Italiens américains? Est-ce que là, ils ont pu bénéficier d'appui, d'aide, de structures éventuellement d'accueil?
Well, if I understood your question correctly, the Italian Jews coming to the US get some solidarity from US Jews, especially because American Jews were responsible for example, signing the affidavits to let Italian Jews come to the US. Of course, the affidavits, the dynamics of affidavits concerned primarily family relations. But if we think of Italian Jewish academicians who made their way to the US, they succeeded in their resettlement in the US thanks to American Jews who were to some extent available to provide prospective Italian Jewish refugees with jobs in US universities. So there was not the same conflict between the conflict between American Jews and Italian Americans was not reflected in the hostility of US Jews toward Italian. but overall, American Jews had had very few opportunities to demonstrate their empathy, their solidarity, their support of Italian Jews. And actually, the Italian Jews who made their way to the US were strengthened in their ethnic consciousness, so to speak. As I tried to suggest during my presentation, Italian Jews did not think of themselves as Jews. They thought of being full-fledged Italians, except for their religious faith. They discovered their Jewishness when they came to the US. They strengthened their feeling of being Jews. Therefore, they tended to make friends, establish connections, develop relations with American Jews rather than with Italian Americans or the US citizens of Italian ancestry. Trying to overcome the language barrier, which was a serious hurdle for Italian Jews, especially for academicians, because the lingua franca of the Italian academia at that time was French, it was not English. So the language was an obstacle to develop relations with American Jews. But a paradox in these dynamics is that Italian Jews came to the US thinking of themselves as Italians and developed or strengthened their Jewishness in the US. And this pushed them to the Jewish rather than to the Italian community.
May I add to think about what Stefano said? I had the chance to study for a project to have Italian-American servicemen who fought in World War II together with the American forces. And there is a number of them who are Jewish coming from Italy. And it's interesting to see how in a couple of cases, these people who were of Jewish extraction and Italian citizens, they just wanted to give up their Jewish identity. And they actually decided not to join both Jewish people or Italian people, but rather American people. So in that sense, somehow played a different, the identity played a different role, because they basically wanted to accelerate their Americanization by renouncing their Italian and Jewish identity. It's just a few cases I met, but it's interesting how the game of identities plays in different ways during World War II. Of course, mine is only a small sample, but just say that people reacted differently in these hard times.
Were they already US citizens?
No, not yet. They were working toward naturalization. They were still Italian subjects of Jewish extraction, and they wanted to become American. And eventually, they got the American citizenship through the service in the military forces.
So there were incentives to renounce their Jewishness and to prove that they were fully fledged Americans. Now, that was a case of one guy that I mentioned in my presentation, Eugenio Fubini Giron, who served in the army, was a professor at the University of Turin, and in order to speed up the acquisition of US citizenship, cut any relations with the Jewish community in the US, but just as an expedient to prove that he deserved the US citizenship.
If you think even Kissinger, there was of Jewish extraction, pretty much leave behind his Jewishness when he's in the United States and joined the American military forces. Probably was a strategy.
Other questions? So I have two. one for each speaker. Stefano, I was wondering, how many of these Jews who left Italy and settled in the US during the interwar years or during the war, how many of them remained in the US proportionately? You know, even if you don't have the number, I'll be curious to have, you know, figures in proportion. And Matteo, I was wondering this very interesting program to have, you know, immigrants, you know, exiles return to Italy and discover the success of Mussolini's program. Were Italians in France and Argentina also targeted, or just Italian Americans?
Mm-hmm.
As for your question, sorry. As for your questions, I do not have figures and statistics, but my impression, it's very empirical. Most Italian Jews made their way to the US before World War II, remained in the US. And they remained in the US because after being kicked out of Italy because of Mussolini's racial laws, they did not want to re-establish any connection with the country that had proved that did not want them. Most lost their jobs after 1938, and it was very difficult to get it back. It was very difficult to regain the property that they had lost before the war. I make an example. Bruno Rossi, who I mentioned in the paper, made a very successful career in the US academia. He was invited to Padua, where he originally held his chair in physics. And when he was invited to Padua, he refused to enter the Department of Physics, who had dismissed him in 1938, forcing his emigration to the US. So the empirical answer to your question is that most eventually made a living in the US, and they remained in the US. Tullia Zevi is, so to speak, an exception that confirms the rule. She married Bruno Zevi. They made their way back to Italy after the war, but that was primarily because Bruno Zevi was involved in the anti-fascist movement. So he had a political aim in making his way back to Italy. But again, I do not have the figures, but the case of the Zevis is the exception.
Yeah, I want to say understandably that they remained in the US. In a way, I'm not surprised. But,
because despite US anti-Semitism, America, so to speak, welcomed them. Contrary to Italy, that had forced them to leave the country and leave the country propertyless.
Yeah, about your question, thank you very much for this interesting question. There is a sort of global fascist project for Italians abroad. So everyone who lived abroad was part of this idea that we should somehow reconnect. So you have to feel part of your Italian identity that equalize a fascist identity. So we have programs that were not launched only in the United States, but everywhere, including France and Argentina. It was more common to have young kids going to the Italian summer camps coming from the Mediterranean area, so especially from Tunisia and Egypt. Argentina was harder because the trip was longer, was expensive, and in Argentina the pro-fascist feeling was pretty much nuanced by anti-fascist feeling. There is a long tradition of Mazzinian sentiments in the Italian Argentinian communities. So the feeling towards Mussolini, was present, but not so strong, such as in Anglo-Saxon countries is. And the case of France is particularly interesting because Italy actually required women who were giving birth to babies to return to Italy in order to give them birth in Italy and having the Italian citizenship. So they didn't want to be born overseas because actually they could become French subject, French citizens. And it's interesting also to conclude that between 1939 and 1940, as I said in my paper, there was a special commission for having migrants returning from abroad because they have to populate the La Patria, they have to contribute to the greatness of Italy and stuff like that. And of course, Italians living in France were one of the first target because France was an enemy, and eventually they were close. They didn't want these people were naturalized French. So basically, many who returned actually came from France, not necessarily because they were fascists, but because they were scared about the outbreak of World War II when Mussolini waged war on France on June 1940. Of course, these people were subject to limitations of their liberty. So basically, before the outbreak of the war, they decided to head back to Italy because they felt safer. That's the only reason, not much because they were fascist. Pro-fascism in France as well was nuanced a little bit by anti-fascism, such as the case of Argentina, despite the fact that we have even stronger feelings of pro-fascism in some parts of France as well. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, oh, yes, definitely. Fascinating. Thank you.